Dr. Block, welcome.
So
Thank
we're
you,
going to
Dr.
get started.
Candiotti.
We're going to get started. Dr. Jeffrey Block was kind enough to agree to do this presentation. So Dr. Block has served our department as a voluntary professor since 2007. He attended Emory University as an undergrad, majoring in chemistry before advancing to medical school at the University of Miami, where he remained for his anesthesia residency before completing a fellowship in pain management right here in 1987. Dr. Block is also a highly awarded botanist and certified master gardener through the University of Florida's Institute of Food and Agricultural Services, and he serves the University of Florida on the advisory committee for Florida's legislated Hemp Pilot Project. In 2014, Dr. Block served the Florida Medical Association by authoring the state's mandated physician education concerning cannabis, published by the Florida Department of Health. And in 2015, he was appointed by Florida Surgeon General to determine the supporting rules to our state's first cannabis law. He originally presented ground rounds to us back in 2017. Now he returns this morning to address us. Since 2020, Dr. Block has authored 3 textbook chapters on this particularly complicated healthcare subject. So we welcome Dr. Block, and if you want to go ahead and share your first slide.
Do you show full screen?
Yes, it does.
Okay, well, let's go. Thank you for the introductions. I wanted to start off with this slide that has nothing to do with cannabis, but everything to do with modern anesthesia. Some great slides from years ago where exhibitions were done for both nitrous oxide and ether. If anybody looks at the top right picture in the lower left corner, there's a flask. And none other than Dr. Papper, who Dr. Candiotti and Dr. Varon would remember, taught me about what that was called. What you're seeing there is popularly known in the verbiage of the day, 17th, 18th century, as ether frolics. And the first public display then of ether, and I'll tell you why I'm going to start with ether, was up here at the Ether Dome, Harvard University up there. And this is where the first public display was. And that's the way science proceeded for the next several decades. But in fact, back in 1842, Crawford Long, and I went to Emory, so there's a hospital named after Crawford Long there, while as actually a medical student, was observing those ether frolics and observed that when people seemingly were doing it, they didn't seem to be sensible to painful stimuli. And so he, in fact, is credited with the first use of it way back in 1842 on March 30th. I'll tell you why that's important for a moment, especially since Dr. Candiotti just brought about last week with nurse anesthetist and next week anesthesia recognition. We went to school here. I went to school here, and this is where the age of discovery largely happens. Wartime, World War II. Rovenstein here and Emanuel Papper, seen where Dr. Papper on the right at Columbia conducted some of the very first and very meaningful research about anesthesia research and safety. And the reason I'm bringing that up is he was my dean at the University of Miami many decades ago, and went on, of course, to actually finish his career emeritus through our department of anesthesiology here. He also was an astute historian, and that's why I wanted to bring up that he brought up to me about how the history of Doctor's Day, which happened later on, March 30th was declared by George Bush first as Doctor's Day, coming up next month, these recognition days, as Dr. Candiotti brought up a moment ago, for physicians. But they were looking for what sentinel event might signify the kindness and compassion that physicians offer in alleviating pain and suffering. And in fact, it came up to the day of the original discovery by what at that point was a medical student who was observing the recreational use of a given drug. And that discovery and its implementation ever since has changed the face of medicine, in particular for our specialty. So in fact, the title that you had originally is, I've adjusted it a little bit because the discovery of receptors, which didn't happen until the early to mid 1990s, is what's really changed the way to revealing what cannabis's medicinal potential is. So with that, let's get right into things to where I wanted to give you my bias. I'm a botanist, I'm a plant guy, and I have a healthy respect for the power of plant chemicals. And I'll share with you a quote by a very popular plant author named Michael Pollan, appropriately. And he says, the biochemical power of plants happens when they nourish us and poison us. They delight our senses of sight, smell, and taste, calm our nerves, or wake us up. They even change the content of our minds and the experience of our consciousness. So again, the power of plants' chemicals has always fascinated me. And I wanted to start off with the first item here of why do plants affect animals? Secondly, but perhaps the most important objective of this morning's grand rounds is to discuss what is the endocannabinoid receptor system's physiologic purpose? And then finally, we'll actually get into cannabis itself with relatively little that's known about it, including relatively little evidence-based data, such that if you have a biologic context on what the purpose of the endogenous system is, then we'll know when we perturbate it what might be really significant as far as potential therapeutics. So starting off with why do plants affect animals in the first place? It's complicated, but I hope to share with you things, including not just by Albert Einstein about the explanations, but other awarded science over the last 40 years, 50 years in particular. But this is what got my attention. When I was at Emory, actually, they showed us a molecule of chlorophyll, and it was just part of our chemistry. And it wasn't until I got into medical school in hematology that I looked at hemoglobin, and they're virtually identical molecules. And when you think about the purpose of each in plants versus animals, they really are the life source molecules. Of course, chlorophyll for being able to transfer light energy into the plant's energy, and of course, hemoglobin transferring oxygen for our real energy source. But those chemicals probably have a common ancestral molecule. And so we're not that different biochemically, perhaps as much as you might think from plants. And actually, the third kingdom of life forms, fungi, might even be more closely related biochemically. Recognition in 1947, Nobel Prize for Chemistry, Sir Robert Robinson realized about alkaloid chemicals. He spent his whole career. So the beginning of last century, he had done research to find the component molecules of the precursors of cocaine, which is shown below, including the indigenous use of it, as well as with morphine. So those discoveries from well over a century ago were regarded as being significant enough for understanding plants' benefits for modern science's understanding how they might benefit health. We know, of course, of curare, and this is a different type of a plant, of course, because of how we use it for neuromuscular blockade. But its discovery, in fact, dates back to where in the 1930s it was experimented with, and by 1942 introduced into anesthesia practice. But the route of delivery makes a huge difference here, because we know if it gets intravascular, it can paralyze. However, this is a picture from 1952. Richard Evans Schultes, a famous ethnobotanist from Harvard, is using a bone to snort curare powder with an indigenous medicine man. The significance here is when inhaled this way, it's not going to paralyze you, but it's widely known as Amazonian tobacco and known to produce psychedelic effects. So routes of delivery make a big difference. Continuing on with Nobel Prize-worthy material in 2015, the original research came from 5,000-year-old Chinese texts about Artemisia annua, not known then for what its chemical did or anything other than the plant, but that it could be useful for parasites. And it was such an important discovery that it got recognized again with another Nobel Award. So moving on then to cannabis, it's obviously different because it's illegal here and you can't get past this. So I wanted to mention that first relative to marijuana, which since 1937 has been the name given to what we regard as the psychoactive form of cannabis, which is the appropriate taxonomic name of the entire plant. So FDA and DEA have very different purposes. I wanted to just show this slide relative to other plants to continue with plants' importance, but in context with what Schedule I really means. So the three key points is that it has a high potential for abuse, no currently accepted medical use, at least in the United States. And the third is lack of accepted safety under medical supervision, which right now is fairly loose for those states supplying medical supervision. This is why it's sort of staying stuck in Schedule I for now, which includes challenges for researching it. But in fact, then we have other medicines that are part of formulary. Of course, these Schedule II right here, opium and cocaine. Most people think of cocaine as not us, but people think of cocaine as being totally illegal. Well, of course, it's not used in ENT extensively. Perhaps the one plant that has the greatest significance for public health, more preventable deaths than anything else by far, is tobacco. And then right here in my backyard, I grow chocolate and coffee. And if you don't think those have certain dependency or habit forming potential, they do, but they're part of culture. So in terms of safety profiles, this slide is from the NIH, but it's actually somewhat misleading in that it's talking about toxicity in terms of death. Cannabis has a profound safety profile for not stopping one from breathing, but that doesn't mean that many people haven't died from it by falling asleep at the wheel and other things. But relative to other things, especially alcohol, perhaps in this case, way up top, which is a direct toxin to cells, particularly brain and liver, cannabis has not been demonstrated to be that. So where do we get to with respect to pain? And that's my bias also from having served and learned about pain in the very department we're talking with right now. It comes back to what I'd like to do as far as talking about how plants have impacted pain in formulary for 150 years. And they're in fact, since the known use of what it was going to be good for, in this case, there are 3 endogenous receptor systems, all identified through plants and each one known individually, but more importantly, collectively to impact the perception of pain. Endorphins discovered in 1974 after I'm already in college, endocannabinoids in 1992 while I'm already out in practice, and then endovanilloids, capsaicin, different senses of things involving pain. These 3 plants have been known for hundreds of years to all impact pain and even were popular formulary, a little more than 100 years ago. But before it was known about how they actually worked. And so the point here in this product called chlorodyne was that the plant extracts of morphine, cannabis, and capsaicin were actually then used in smaller amounts, representing its impact on endorphins, endocannabinoids, and endovanilloids, unknown at the time. But what was known is that smaller amounts of each collectively could be safer used and would produce fewer side effects than equal analgesic quantities of either morphine, cannabis, or capsaicin alone. Nevertheless, it was documented as an effective treatment for pain, but also abused. So I wanted to talk a moment about the research, at least, that has been directed through the NIH and a very important paper that came out in 2013, because it's very easy to lose focus of what the target is. The target is the impact on the endogenous system. I can't overemphasize that. And in fact, an archer who stays purely focused has to focus only on the target. And if the distraction of that little cannabis leaf at the end of the arrow is causing the archer to deviate focus, there's going to be more misses. In a conceptual way, that's what's going on right now. So staying purely focused on endocannabinoids is key. And this paper that came out in 2013 with the article is written by Pal Packer and George Kunos from the NIH. And they're not only PhD researchers, they're MD PhD researchers with knowledge of clinical impact. This is what that paper said, and this is what got my attention. Modulating the endocannabinoid system activity may have therapeutic potential in almost all diseases affecting humans. That's a powerful statement. Almost all diseases affecting humans. It's not there yet, but this is the power of that particular system, which I'll explain the mechanics of in a short while. In terms of what it actually does work for today, and this article was not available to me the last time I delivered grand rounds in 2017. It actually came out in January of that year, but it's shown through this that, in fact, this slide today is a good summary slide for what it's known to impact and what it's not. And so I just wanted to point out a few key things, is that it's not a first-line treatment for any debilitating disease, at least not now, but that THC has its best efficacy for chemotherapy, chronic pain, and multiple sclerosis muscle spasms. CBD, which has become more popular also since we spoke last, has its best efficacy for intractable epilepsy. That actually is where it has FDA approval use for now, but can also be helpful for schizophrenia, particularly anxiety, and to a lesser extent, inflammation. Everything else is anecdotal, but it doesn't preclude the interest in investigating this further. And in fact, these are the formularies that are available and the research that's been done. That middle column and the column on the right, if you could focus on a moment, let's go to the column on the right. It lists the different scheduling of cannabis's component chemicals, whether collective with the entire plant or THC versus CBD independently. But the idea is that the research that went into the scheduling, that middle column, is based on doses that are far less than the plant that's around today. Those would be considered relatively baby doses by today's standards. So in fact, we've had information about cannabis going back in the US Pharmacopoeia, the first issue, which is from 1820. So about 200 years of federally supplied information through the US Pharmacopoeia. But that stopped in 1942 after the 1937 Marijuana Tax Act made it illegal. So in fact, I wanted to just point this out about the AMA and what its disposition has been on health and wellness today, but not only today, back in 1937, with the passage of that first law, the AMA actually had at that point an MD JD, an attorney who was representing the AMA in his opinion on that particular act, and Dr. William Woodward. And he wanted to know that the AMA encouraged unfettered scientific research and that neither the AMA or enlightened medical individuals sponsored that law's politicized rationale. It is still being politicized today. And he mentioned that it's an unknown quantity at that time, but it might have important uses in medicine and psychology. So in fact, cannabis's prohibition does have, and I'm saying side effects, that have undermined its research and education ever since. That doesn't preclude that in the late 1980s, there was first the identification of a cannabinoid receptor in a rat brain. I want to tell you that endocannabinoids function not only in mammals, not only in vertebrates. It goes way back evolutionary-wise to even be found in invertebrates. Virtually all animals have endocannabinoid systems, and it's to basically manage what nature throws at that animal that could be threatening, so as to keep the physiology of that animal in balance such that the natural effects doesn't overwhelm and kill off that particular animal. So we've covered a little bit about plants. Now I'd like to speak a little bit more about endocannabinoids and what its physiologic purpose is. I just alluded it to a while ago about balance. And that, in fact, is what it is. I've shown the image here, of course, on a cannabis leaf. We do not have endocannabinoids because there's a plant out there. The plant itself didn't evolve until about 60 million years ago, while endocannabinoids can be documented through invertebrates to go back 500 million years. And humans didn't really appear in current form until a little over 1 million, but certainly the last 200,000 years for modern man. It's not a plant that's there for us. But the balances also exist within the plant between the two principal phyto or plant-derived cannabinoids called cannabidiol, THC, and delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, mercifully abbreviated as THC. So I wanted to point out, if you look carefully now, this is an older slide, 2013, but in the top left corner there, there's CB1 and CB2 receptors among other receptor systems. The point here is that those receptors are situated in such a way that they influence all other receptors. And so all other physiologic systems are impacted by it. And so it's revealed some very interesting things, including what coordinates the systemic functions that previously have been holistically but scientifically elusive. Some people call it the brain-gut connection. It connects the mind and the body in a working sense. And in this sense, as you can see, it's known to do these various things peripherally. But we think right now of cannabis being something that really works mostly centrally. Those are CB1 receptors. And I'll point out the difference between CB1 and CB2 receptors, which much less is known about. But I believe most of the therapeutics of the future will lie with things that impact CB2 receptors. I wanted to go through the mechanism, though, of how this actually works, because when Dr. Varon and I were residents, we didn't know this. We were sort of taught neurophysiologically that afferent, efferent pathways were relatively one-way loops back and forth from the brain. But in fact, there's a little feedback loop that happens at every single synapse. That's why I'm showing you here a synapse. The top being the presynaptic, the bottom surface is a postsynaptic surface. And in fact, there's receptors, CB receptors on the surface of the synapse there. And through retrograde feedback, all neurological actions happen. And that feedback happens through two endogenous ligands. They're called 2-AG and anandamide. They have different functions. And so now you have two different ligands operating on two different types of receptors. And that's important for the numerous ways that cannabinoids can work to modify physiology. They're lipids. And remember, the space around nerves internally there is a lipid area. Peripherally, it's going to be aqueous, but the lipids make this fascinating to me because the chemistry there is very different. And unlike what slide I showed you before about the Nobel Prize by Dr. Robertson, those were alkaloid chemicals, water soluble, easy to precipitate out through salts what the active chemical is of an alkaloid. But in fact, fats are different and much more challenging to separate. It wasn't known for many more years what would happen there. But when those CB1 receptors are impacted, they release those, in this case, glutamate neurotransmitters, and the feedback that happens changes what happens with how much on the postsynaptic surface of 2-AG and anandamide are released. And that feedback loop is what tends to attenuate the CB1 receptor's impact on anything being released from that particular receptor. Everything that gets released that way is impacted. So that's the way neurologically we keep a fine-tuned balance at all times. These two endogenous ligands are released on demand and instantaneously degraded. So in fact, they're very hard to isolate, but the work done through Raphael Meshulam's lab at Hebrew University is what elucidated those chemicals. And they work, again, in a fine-tuning way to sometimes increase through positive regulation what happens at that synapse through full agonists or partial agonists. And they also can have negative regulation, which can attenuate things. So overall, I wanted to point this out to tell you how sophisticated the neurophysiology is that's done by endocannabinoids impacting everything else in the body. The research is going on now, mostly, as I mentioned, CB1. We know far more about its neurobehavioral impact, but CB2 is really cool because that's what its impact has on diseases and immune system functions. And to tell you why I'm so fascinated by that and think there's so much more use is that what people haven't said succinctly is that endocannabinoids' impact on CB2 receptors is essentially the system that allows a disease to remain in us and become chronic. Otherwise, many of these diseases would kill us outright, but the ability to compensate and stay in the game, or the chronicity of disease that we're able to live with. We die from one thing, but along with it, many other disease processes that just impact us with advancing age. This is the system that defines disease chronicity. This actually is fascinating to me too, because it speaks to how we look at CB2 receptors. In this case, this is a PET scan, and anything that lights up, particularly green and yellow, the red is a little more blood flow, liver there you see, and maybe around the kidneys. But if you look, there's a tiny little IV site on the left side there by the hand. This is a radioactive isotope that attaches to CB2 receptors, and 2 hours later, this is where they are. It's not in the brain. It's not in the heart or the lungs or the periphery. It's in the gut. And we know that the gut is where most of the immune systems are. So in fact, the ancient Chinese knew this. And I've taken a course at UM, 105-hour CME course on acupuncture, where it's obvious in the way it's taught that qi, which is the life flow force, doesn't go through the brain, heart, or lungs. It in fact goes through the abdomen. And today, in modern times, we associate health or life with immunity. And so that's in fact what I believe that the ancients were actually tuned into, even though they had no idea of how or why. This is where I find the throwback to acupuncture to be fascinating, where truly East meets West in a sense. And that is, in the best sense of the word, integrative medicine. Moving then again along, let's get into cannabis now, because the plant itself is, of course, what has everybody's attention. But with that biologic basis to how and why it's working, when we look at the cannabis plant itself, There are some things that I wanted to bring up about CB1 and CB2 receptors. In the middle, I've put a circle around THC, but those are other research molecules that are known to impact the CB receptors. And what they do in a real-time basis, again, is fascinating, particularly CBD. Cannabidiol is really the epitome of polypharmacy. It doesn't directly impact the receptors, but it does influence their breakdown. It actually has many other impacts, including on TRPV1 receptors. That was the slide I showed you about endovaniloids before. And here's the TRPV1 receptor, and in fact, what it's known to do in terms of how its impact for nociceptive heat. And so cannabinoids are involved this way as well throughout the body. So I'm bringing this up because I wanted to point out physiologically about, for research purposes, the common molecule I showed you earlier about chlorophyll and hemoglobin is not so in this arena, because in fact, when you look up top to see what animals endogenously have, what the molecules of anandamide and 2-AG look like, they look nothing like what plant molecules of tetrahydrocannabinol and cannabidiol look like on the bottom. So what they do share, and again, this is a lipid structure working in a lipid environment, they have remarkably similar lipid solubilities, and that is what impacts their ability to impact cannabinoid receptors. So there is work being done with receptors, and mostly in allosteric modulators on receptors, where not all of a function may be impacted through an allosteric modulator, but some, and preserving others with normal function. And it's more than hit or miss. It happens when you have a allosteric modulator that may mitigate some of the toxic or less desired side effects and not impede some of the physiologic functions of cannabinoid receptors, that there you have a potential medicine. And such is the case with pregnenolone, an endogenous steroid. When you look at it as a negative allosteric modulator, some things augment things, but in this case, overall attenuates the response of the receptor. It's very similar to what cannabidiol does at the receptor, also as a negative allosteric modulator. When given pregnenolone, it tends to mitigate some of the euphoric and the mind side effects of THC. And that's why I'm bringing up pregnenolone in particular for its value as a potential medicine as a negative allosteric modulator. So getting back to cannabis itself, it's nothing new. This is something in China, a tomb from 700 BC. But in here, I wanted to point out that in those vessels were found not simply cannabis, but the female flowers of the cannabis plant, where we know are the greatest concentration of those bioactive cannabinoids. It was regarded back then because it had been part of culture, and generally the plant remained not just basically the same, but in balance with respect to THC and CBD for thousands of years. However, 1970, I'm using that time to point out things about a change. And going back just one slide more here, even ancient fields, and this one in the Middle East and Lebanon, those fields had a balance between THC and CBD. Why do I mention that? Because in cultivars of cannabis that have comparable amounts of THC and CBD, CBD tends to mitigate some of the side effects, including paranoia of THC. And so, in fact, it's very hard to find balanced cultivars today. And I'll briefly tell you why. Because before 1970, plants were relatively weak. The axis on the left shows the percent dry weight of how much cannabinoids, THC and CBD, are found in the plant flowers. Approximately 4 or 5% was about all you would find. However, after 1970, which not coincidentally is when the Controlled Substances Act became enacted, under its prohibition, an illegal market would tend to want to emphasize more THC than CBD, because THC is in fact what is being outlawed. The same thing happened under alcohol prohibition. Nobody was selling wine and beer. They're relatively impotent, so it was about whiskey and even moonshine. And in fact, today's cannabis can be viewed as sort of the moonshine equivalent of cannabis, and maybe even grown with that same stills in the hills mentality, but the hills now, in fact, may be the Rocky Mountains instead of Appalachia. The plant changed. And one of the key reasons it's changed is many years later, from that other slide I showed you with Richard Evans Schultes. Here he is in Afghanistan. in 1973, and he is looking at a plant of cannabis found in that part of the world. Cannabis generally, and hemp, are 20 to 24-foot plants, grow incredibly quickly. And in this case, he's looking at a particular kind of cannabis plant that's only about 4 feet tall, but has strong genetics for lots of THC and lots of another chemical that cannabis plants have in it called terpenes. Terpenes are the chemicals that give all plants their smells. And they're also powerful drivers for how animals react to those plants. Think about smelling a rose or a repulsive smell or things like that. Smells are part of how we're hardwired. So the key point about why this plant became the darling of breeders ever since is not simply to push those dominant genetics for lots of THC, and in this case, lots of a particular terpene called myrcene, which I'll tell you about in a moment. But the fact that it's a 4-foot squatty plant was absolutely key because it became the breeder's favorite simply because it's easy to hide from a helicopter. So in fact, then under its prohibition, those plants, Afghani Kush and skunk number 1, bring dominant traits to certain hybrids emphasizing THC and myrcene. So after then, going and developing over the last over 50 years, the amount of THC has steadily increased such that now you'll find more than 25% THC dry weight, a single secondary metabolite. It's actually a botanical feat to have done that. But more recently, CBD has also increased to up to about 15%. I want to emphasize the lower left corners by saying that the isolates themselves, THC alone, unbalanced by CBD, or even CBD in itself unbalanced with THC, one has side effects and one doesn't, but in a traditional sense, by a traditional user of plant-based medicines, particularly Eastern cultures, both would be regarded as unbalanced. So in fact, then unbalanced plants, in a sense, devolved and evolved from traditionally balanced plants. Moving on then, a traditional Eastern healer's perspective on something like that, and I'm going to give a quote from Deepak Chopra, who said that isolating an active constituent from a plant is an affront to nature. It's like taking the intelligence and leaving the wisdom behind. I wanted to point out a neuroanatomical advantage. It's the one that ties into the slide I showed you with the safety profile towards toxicity, in that the yellow dots represent where THC throughout the brain has impact. So judgment, reward, memory, movement, sensations, a lesser extent vision, but certainly coordination. However, where you don't see it is in the brainstem. And that neuroanatomical advantage is why it is virtually impossible to have someone stop breathing from the medulla pons area's impact the same way you would with opioids and other sedative hypnotics. So I wanted to point out the changes since the 1970s about dosing. The saying about if you can't control your dose can control you dates back to the 1970s when we're basically, going into medical school. Dr. Varon and I would have started our residencies and known each other way back then when this was a parody and actually kind of funny. But the size of that joint there may have evoked laughter, but the concentration today would make that something that would be just crazy potent with THC. And in fact, then one of the keys I wanted to show you is the modern plant where those buds, the female flowers that have the greatest concentration, they're in structures that are creating the little frosting effect on the outside of that female flower's bud. And those structures are called trichomes. This is the change again since 1970 from about 4% THC to 25% or so today. And those trichomes and terpenes are made in these structures. They look like little golf balls on a tease or little mushrooms there. And that, in fact, is what is harvested and why those plants are harvested. If just those trichomes are rubbed off into a concentrate, that's hashish. And these oils, again, these are oils, are concentrated in particular now in greater concentrations and potency than ever before. So getting into a toxicologist's understanding of pharmacy, Paracelsus in the 16th century is famous for having said that sometimes the dose defines a poison, and I don't want to lose sight of that. With all of the research and the presentations you've had, even just a few months ago, on cannabis research, A lot of that research, in my opinion, is sort of hit and miss, or where you get funding for something. I didn't find that many things so relevant to anesthesia practice, but just a month ago, this study came out that talks about postoperative sensations that heavy regular users have, when in fact their sensation to pain is impacted by how much cannabis they use. So in this case, they wanted to show postoperatively how important it might be to ask. There's still a tendency for physicians to feel afraid to ask, or patients not to want to tell. But as of last count, even here in Florida, we now have approximately 800,000 Florida citizen patients legally using cannabis, and there's probably many more than that illegally still continuing to use it. So physicians nowadays really do have to learn more about and ask. Whether legal or illegal is not the question. It's a matter of patient safety, in particular post-operatively here. So big business. And in fact, the decisions on what to do with cannabis come down to a burgeoning industry's contributions to public health costs versus benefits. I can't say this without talking a bit about driving. The University of Iowa has a wonderful driving simulator used by the National Transportation Board. And it, in fact, does impact driving. You will know this if you're behind somebody on the road, with the most persistent and consistent finding being that drivers under the influence show an inability to stay within the lane. And unlike alcohol, there is an understanding of maybe fear or paranoia about driving. So unlike the alcoholic who may say, I'll take the keys and drive without necessarily control and understanding of speed or direction, a cannabis impaired driver generally may be driving particularly cautiously slow and then still being unable to stay within a lane. Contraindications to use, we have to include this here. And the most important things I'll present to you now, that our colleagues in psychiatry are confronted with perhaps being the most polarized specialty I know of. There are practitioners who understand that there are anxiolytic benefits to certain illnesses, including PTSD, to where they find it has fewer side effects than some other meds. So in fact, they will be ones who maybe are using it and recommending it for patients. But that same field, of course, now has many of the addictionologists being board certified. And I'm going to bring up that, of course, I'm boarded, but when I did my pain management fellowship, it was something that was taught alongside with addiction medicine in those days, because there was neither a specialty specific to anesthesia board certification in either pain management or addiction medicine in psychiatry in those days. So I'm trained like a dinosaur. There are pre-existing significant cardiac disease risks. Older people who especially try some of these newer potent things, it is an afterload reducer, and you'll sometimes see people quite instantly get very lightheaded, sometimes faint and fall right on their face. But pre-existing, and I'm emphasizing significant cardiac disease because a lot of older people are using this, whether they say it or not, sometimes particularly to assist with sleep. The third contraindication is pregnancy, and I can't overemphasize this for two reasons. Number one, and I'll show you this slide just to sort of show you again, whether it's tobacco or this, lighting up, smoking, robbing oxygen is probably the single most determinant to bad outcome in the fetus by robbing the oxygen during development. But neuropathways involving endocannabinoids exist in utero and then continue not only till age 18, where certain things may be legal, or alcohol legal at 21, but probably to almost the mid-20s when those pathways are still being laid down. And in youth, heavy consistent use can have impact on neurodevelopment that, although there are very limited longitudinal studies, the one from Dunedin, not Florida, Dunedin, New Zealand, have shown that there can be impacts even on IQ from the user who uses early and consistently. So vaping is a different way of getting those bioactive molecules in, THC, CBD, and to a lesser extent terpenes, which actually are more volatile and blown off at lower heating temperatures. But this is below the level of combustion, which releases those aromatic hydrocarbons that are known to cause cancer. So in fact, cannabis use is not necessarily known to cause cancer, but it can, of course, for your purposes preoperatively cause chronic bronchitis and those pulmonary concerns associated with smoking and debris. But I want to point out that right before COVID, vaporizing was associated, in this case, I'm also bringing up Juul, which is perhaps equally, in a sense, guilty, but for nicotine. But vaping deaths happened, and we were talking about these in autumn and winter of 2019, right before COVID had us talking about the shortage of ventilators. Well, those ventilators were being used by some kids who were smoking or vaporizing contaminated oils. These were found out to be black market contaminated oils by a vitamin E acetate. In any event, I wanted to point this out because this is perhaps one of the ways that the legal market would be better scrutinized so that it had oversight to avoid contaminants being allowed to be introduced for common use. Moving along, for kids and accessing kids like candies, and a legal market wouldn't produce this, but an illegal market would. And the appeal to kids, just like most other things that kids reach for when they're in high school, is very, very well known with cannabinoids, and in this case, putting THC concentrates into these products, or who knows what else. Nevertheless, it's legal in many places, available legally to most Americans in the United States as of 2023, including Florida. Those states that are in the darkest green actually allow what is called adult use, which is the euphemism for recreational use. And I'd say it's a euphemism because kids do and will get it in that setting in particular. And so what's a physician to do? Well, it's a balancing act. I understand that in the clinical practices now, whether you're a physician who chooses to recommend it or not, those patients are coming to your practices. And in that sense, as anesthesiologist, sometimes you have to come up with the decision to cancel a case. I'd suggest if anybody comes in acutely intoxicated, that may be the appropriate thing to do. But in terms of chronic users, you'll find that many people will use it and adjust to it to where it's like the guy who has the 2 martini lunch every day, and they don't necessarily act or perform poorly with it. You'll find some users of cannabis, even in larger amounts, that can hold their THC the way some people seemingly can hold their alcohol. In terms of what is the right dose, and I'm showing this turtle from, if anybody remembers Finding Nemo, there's the little stoner turtle. But the optimal way of looking at this is a philosophy of start low with those baby doses that are, again, harder and harder to find. How hard? Well, it means that with all of the concentration in those female flower buds, 1 full bud, which may be the size of your thumb, is far too much. You would take something the size of a pencil eraser, then cut it maybe in fourths to get something that approximates 2.5 to 5 milligrams of THC. 2.5 milligrams of THC would be the threshold dose that's known to, in some people, be perceived as some kind of an effect. But the dosing of 2.5 milligrams is hard to find unless somebody were to separate it that small of an aliquot. So again, the goal of an optimal dose is to ensure that not only a cannabis naive, but a cannabis savvy patient achieves safe and effective outcomes where the clinical benefits outweigh the risks. And the goal of the outcome, of course, is that it's the receptors function that's impacted by this remains consistent with the whole system's health purpose, which is to maintain a balance of physiology. So here's a point I want to bring up that is key to the dosing. And it's about the dose response curve for pain that's known to exist. Almost all diseases impacted by cannabis, with the possible exceptions of cancer pain and in some people, PTSD, especially in advanced users. Almost all other examples, including for pain, show a inverted U dose response curve, such that too little of a dose, no impact. Just the right amount, absolutely an observable impact to pain relief. But those people who do more than that, not only sometimes getting back to their baseline, but sometimes even worse. And that's where someone starts to chase their own tail, seeking more and more pain relief when they've long passed the threshold for where at the top of that peak on the right might impact the greatest therapeutic potential for cannabis as a pain reliever. Cannabis doesn't only work for physical pain. And I want to point out, having done my fellowship in pain, that pain itself is not really a qualifying condition. It's not a diagnosis per se. It's a sign and symptom of many diseases and injuries, such that pain, if it's not physical, as an intolerable symptom, a lot of people interpret intolerable symptoms as psychologically intolerable or even spiritually intolerable for some people. And in that sense, I think that you'll find a lot of people reach to cannabis for those psychological and spiritual uncomfortable or intolerable symptoms. That's a fairly profound statement, but I wanted people who think about pain purely as a physical phenomenon to understand that pain is a bit more complicated than that when we look at what people perceive as pain. So again, moving right along to try to finish up here, there's an ethical challenge of what should we be doing while it remains under federal prohibition. There are medical legal ethics from the AMA that tell us absolutely that a physician shall respect the law and recognize responsibility to seek changes in those requirements. However, we're licensed in two ways. We have a state license and, of course, a DEA, a federal license, to where it's obviously illegal. So in fact, perhaps a bioethical approach to this might be more appropriate rather than simply medical legal. Bioethics evolved after World War II to deal with such things as nuclear energy versus weaponizing it, and even stem cells. At our own institution, when the first stem cell lines came out that were limited in use, it was because of sort of an interference with the whole process of it. Once we got past stem cells constraints with a bioethical basis, think of all the people who have been saved by that today. So perhaps seeking relief from intolerable physical, psychological, or spiritual symptoms of injury is an instinctual response, and it contributes to medicinal substances use. That would be from the purview of the patient, but the treatment of intolerable symptoms is a noble task that society bestows upon us, healers, to provide humane relief. I've been fortunate to give the oath of medicine at the university here. I did choose to quote this since we talk about Hippocrates in the sense of oaths, even though we give the oath of Geneva. And yet I wanted to share with you in this concluding slide, there are some information out there. You'll be relatively hard pressed to find real textbooks that have information, but I have been published in 3 chapters, this one in Advanced Therapeutics in Pain Medicine, another coming out this year, the 7th edition of Brody's Human Pharmacology has 2 chapters I was asked to revise. And then finally, Cannabis Chemistry and Biology Fundamentals. I wrote the opening chapter for Dr. El Sole. Dr. El Sole runs the farms. He's a PhD pharmacist and botanist, a colleague in a botany sense, at the University of Mississippi, which has been the federal government's only source for legal research material for the last 40 years. He is a colleague and asked me to write this. That'll come out later this year. So thank you for your time. This is how I can be contacted. And if we have any time for questions, I'd be happy to entertain them.
Yes, Jeff, we do have some time for questions. If you want to take your stop the sharing there for a moment. So if anybody has any questions, you can go ahead and put them on the chat. But let me just fire up the first question while people put their thoughts together. So as you know, there have been some backlash, at least on the anesthesiology community, on the legalization of marijuana for medical use. In part, the feeling is that the data may not support all the uses that has been purported of. And I just want to, let me just share this screen, which basically summarizes that. Let me go ahead and share my screen here for a second. So for example, in other words, editorial from Dr. Naguib here in Anesthesia and Analgesia about the medical use of marijuana. And it goes through the entire dissertation. But this is what he wrote at the bottom line. More than a century and a half ago, O'Shaughnessy report, we still have no documented the efficacy of marijuana for any medical indication other than as transient treatment for sobriety. And as you know, there has been a lot of backlash. So I just want to know your thoughts about it.
If that was presented before I presented Grand Rounds in 2017, I would find it hard to refute that. But the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine's 2017 report, a federally commissioned survey and retrospective look, in a sense, weeded out. That's not okay, poor use of the word weeded out. It is a federally commissioned meta-analysis of all of the research that went into up to that point. And in fact, they did find those particular indications I listed on the slide for the efficacy and where either substantial or conclusive evidence-based data existed, which covered, again, and I'm going to show it from the beginning, the nausea and vomiting associated with chemotherapy. Nausea and vomiting have been associated with other food intolerances, and appetite augmentation absolutely has conclusive evidence-based data. Substantial evidence-based data, the next highest category, exists for chronic pain. And in fact, if that was referenced there and they looked carefully at the National Academy's findings, I think that statement at the end, in this case, shows the editorial bias of that particular author. I can have that debate with them if they'd like. The third indication of the muscle spasms from multiple sclerosis impacting 80% of all patients afflicted with MS has substantial evidence-based data, and that's why a medicine from GW Pharma called nabiximols, which is the combination of equal parts THC and CBD, starting very low doses and increased, is currently available in 30 countries throughout the world and has a relatively good safety margin. It hasn't gotten past our FDA approval. It's been languishing there for close to a decade. Those three indications, and most importantly, recently, the cannabinoids for CBD for kids with seizures, which albeit was a orphan drug application that got through fast track, CBD now having been redefined through the 2018 Farm Bill, puts it on a nutraceutical path, and its safety profile for that particular isolate as a plant-derived cannabinoid has specific indications. I think you'll see that used more for anxiety than for pain. But again, anxiety is a key component to the perception of pain. And in that sense, I can say that those 4 or 5 qualifying conditions have either substantial or conclusive evidence-based data, which is what I don't see acknowledged in the report you've just shared, Dr. Varon.
Okay, so yeah, that's a report from 2015. So I guess there has been a paradigm shift, I guess, over the last few years, giving the information that you have provided us.
I'll add that there is a lot of research being done, and a lot of that research comes from outside of the US. We tend to be self-centered in how we look at different studies, but it happens in places with countries doing the kind of research you would expect. For instance, Germans are looking at mind and psychosis, things like that. The Italians tend to look at things involving metabolic syndrome. Research by the Spanish have been doing things with neural things, including cancers and glioblastomas. It's a developing field where sometimes the baggage of the previous bias undermines us either understanding or being willing to look further and deeper into it. There's the other counterbalance side of the impacts on public health, and I'm not denying that at all. And I think the importance of that is something that has to be brought to light. But it doesn't mean that the abuse of ether 150 or more years ago stopped instantly upon its discovery as a potential analgesic or anesthetic in that case. But it's a process. And I think as the process moves through the federal constraints of prohibition in terms of what that does, not only for researching it, but for sort of its acceptance, if under controlled situations for use, makes it critically important. Unfortunately, right now, most of the physicians who are recommending it are doing relatively poor jobs in following up for patient outcome. And that's where we should be most obviously critical.
A few more questions. So from Dr. Rodriguez, thank you for a great and informative lecture regarding the use of edibles. In the pediatric literature, there is an increasing number of accidental ingestion by children. What role can we play as anesthesiologists to decrease this? Any thoughts on prevention?
Yeah, don't give it to kids. And if you're going to have it taken orally, understand this. When edibles are taken, and now we're talking about edibles containing THC, not necessarily edibles that are only cannabidiol, which doesn't have the same side effects. THC, when it goes through digestion, gets converted by the liver to 11-hydroxy-THC, and that's important because 11-hydroxy-THC compared to THC lasts about 4 times longer and is about 4 times more potent. So in fact, with a delayed onset, somebody who is not familiar with an edible, now I'm talking adult now, we'll talk about kids in a moment, An adult may think, oh, well, I don't feel anything. 15 minutes later, have another edible or a cookie, because this is used in baked goods too. At a certain time then, perhaps an hour or so later, that particular user's experience is just beginning. And sometimes with that big of a dose, especially in an IV user, it will elicit paranoia. When kids get it, the same thing, or animals can get it too. They behave just like an adult, generally stupor, coordination problems, sleeping it off. But obviously packaging makes a big difference. Not making it look like a gummy, which might be interpreted as a candy, keeping it out of reach of kids. Most of those kids get it from mommy or daddy's stash. Okay. And so, yes, I mentioned before the importance of keeping chronic use away from kids, but kids do get edibles there. And in terms of edibles, you'll probably find more misuse of edibles turning up in ERs, especially on weekend nights, than any other source, including smoking or vaping.
Another question. Recent ASRA guidelines recommend anesthesiologists screen all patients for cannabis use, including asking about the type of cannabis product, use, how it was used, smoke, ingested, amount used, how recently it was used, and frequency of use. Any comments about that?
Yeah, I think that the amount, frequency, and timing of use varies so tremendously from the familiar, user versus the naive user, that's a big consideration. As I mentioned before, some people will overtly show and some people won't. There's a resetting of sort of the barometers that we have. And it's obviously something where we have just so many receptors and you can downregulate in the chronic user. How far you should go into testing people, obviously asking is the first best thing. And when is the last time that you used is appropriate, including for anesthesia purposes because of the oxygen.
Actually, that was Dr. Mala's question. It says, when you screen pre-op patients for use of THC or CBD, do you mean historically or actually testing the patient?
Yeah, well, actually testing the patient does not correlate with impairment, number one. Recent use in terms of how frequently it's being used, if somebody says, oh, I don't smoke, but they're only talking about cigarettes, or I don't smoke cigarettes, but they're really smoking cannabis and they, smoked right before they came in, an accomplished user may not look stoned, but they're still having the effects on the lungs and oxygen carrying capacity by having smoked, period. So asking is very important. A lung exam is very important, but evaluate your patient the same way. The only caution I would say is not so much from smoking, but if someone had an edible right before coming in and may not show it immediately, but it can sometimes take an hour before those edibles get to be seen for its impact, and you put somebody to sleep and next thing you know, they're waking up at the peak of an edible's drug impact, means they may wake up rather slowly. It doesn't mean necessarily with more pain, but I wanted to bring up the more pain and being more of a challenge perhaps in the recovery room by that recent article published earlier this year. I don't know if that gives you enough insight to answer the question succinctly.
Yeah, that was the following question I have. Says, even though some people use cannabis therapeutically to help relieve pain, from an anesthetic standpoint, studies have shown regular users may have more pain and nausea after surgery, not less.
Yeah, and it doesn't mean everybody, but it means that that's what that report that just came out at the beginning of last month was suggesting. So again, I would treat it the same way you treat any patient. Ask, and now that you're hopefully more aware of what that patient may need post-op, I think it's highly impractical to, with as many hundreds of thousands of patients, even only here in Florida, are using, to tell the patient, go home and abstain for the next 2 weeks and come back and we'll reschedule your case. That's different than the patient who comes in overtly stoned. Okay, that's a little different type of thing. But to have patients who may have it recommended by another physician, that creates a slippery slope, the same way that opioids prescribed by another physician will impact the post-op analgesic requirements of that particular patient. Treating each patient as an individual, I believe, is still the best information I can give you with this, as well as other things. I mean, there's kratom, there's magic mushrooms and psilocybin now, and how do you deal with somebody, of course, who may have had a visit to a ketamine clinic, a legal ketamine clinic a week before? It's not that ketamine is staying in the body. cannabis and its chemicals, because they are fat soluble, remain detectable in the blood for long periods of time, but correlate very poorly with impairment or even
Okay.
anti-analgesics.
I don't know, Dalton Fasekas, who's one of our residents who was very interested in your presentation and brought it to my attention. Is Dalton, you're there? You have any questions? You can unmute yourself there for a second. Let me see. He's not unmuting at this time, but that's okay. I'm sure he can contact you and ask you any other questions he has. Well, Jeff, this was a great presentation. Thanks for bringing it back after 5 years. It's still very interesting. I appreciate it. Truly appreciate doing this. So this is going to be the end of the session. Now we're going to get to the OR. We'll try to be careful out there. Thank you, everyone, for attending the session.
Thank you.